Like Lauren said, we're going to try and keep things on time. So if you do go past time, I might interrupt as politely as I can and talk over you and so forth. You all know the structure, but if you have any questions for us, for me or Carol, please let us know now and we're happy to help answer anything.
Merci tout le monde de vous joindre à nous on behalf of Climate Action Network Canada. We're really glad you made the time. Just quickly, I don't know if we can just check the pronunciation of the Green Party candidate's name. So is it Dr. Seisman? Just to make sure we don't.
Zeman.
Zeman.
Yeah, so if you just don't say the S, that'll get you where you need to be. And the first name is, if you treat the E like an A, then you'll be fine.
Got it.
So Imre Szeman.
And that's it's right. Caro or is it Carolyn?
It's Carolyn. And the most important thing you need to know is not Caroline.
Okay, Carolyn. Okay, Fatima, nice to see you. And I'll try. The rest of us usually are used to grilling Mr. Wilkinson on Zoom. So this will probably be much easier for him.
Great.
Okay, are we good to get started?
Yeah, we can let people in.
Awesome. I'm going to hit start webinar and then you'll be on. People are starting to join. Go ahead.
Should I give them a minute?
Yeah, maybe another 30 seconds or so.
Okay. Well, the number is shooting up. Hi, everyone. It's my total pleasure to welcome you to this election 2021 Climate Leadership Roundtable. There was huge demand for a climate conversation, so we're very happy to be able to do this for you all. My name is Fatima Syed. You may know me as a journalist with the Narwhal's brand new Ontario Bureau. I'm also the host of The Backbench, a podcast about Canadian politics, and many other things that I've been writing. But before we dig into this conversation, I'd like to do some brief housekeeping as you all trickle in. We have translation tonight, and we've got closed caption services available for this webinar. And if you're looking for translation, please click the globe icon on the bottom of the window to enable a French language soundtrack. Please note that the translation feature is not supported if you're using your phone for audio, so you do have to be on your laptop. For those of you who are not familiar with using interpretation services, just a heads up that it is normal that what you hear is not as fluid as usual. Remember that there's a human being, in this case, our interpreter, Madeline, who has to translate every speaker's word as we go. You're very welcome to join in the conversation through the chat function. Please feel free to send questions or comments. Keep in mind that our chat moderators are closely monitoring that conversation, and any abusive language won't be tolerated. Any breach of this rule will result in the removal of the Zoom call.
Merci, Fatima. Au nom du réseau Action Climat, ça me fait vraiment plaisir de vous souhaiter la bienvenue ce soir à notre table ronde.
I am very happy to welcome you to the election 2021 Climate Leadership Roundtable. I am Caroline Product. I'm a director of the policies at the Climate Action Network. This is the greatest network that we work against climate change in Canada. I'm here from Montreal. We have over 130 organizations in this network. We have members from First Nation, social justice organization, youth, health, a religious group, and local initiative. A reminder that we have interpreters with us, so you can click on the globe at the bottom of your screen. You can choose your language. Note that you will not be able to use such a feature if you're on your cell phone. It's normal if what you hear is not as fluid as usual because Madeline is human and she's trying her best to translate all I'm saying as soon as I do it. So I wish you a great session.
So I'm now going to introduce our panelists. We've got Dan Albas for the Conservative Party, Laurel Collins from the NDP, Kristina Michaud from Bloc Québécois, Dr. Imre Szeman from the Green Party, and Jonathan Wilkinson from the Liberal Party, and Environment Minister at the moment. Thank you all for being here. A very quick overview of the format. We're going to have 2-minute opening statements in random order where these panelists can pitch their climate platforms to you all. We're going to go through a series of topics, including Indigenous rights, the urgency of getting to zero emissions, just transition, and leaving no one behind. Each candidate has 2 minutes to answer the question, and there will be a few minutes for follow-up questions from me and Caro. One last follow-up question to each party at the end will also be done by me, so look forward to that. Cards will be shown when there are 30 seconds left to each panelist, which we've already gone through with them. So if you see someone holding up a green card, that's just 30 seconds left, and then yellow means time's almost up. We're expecting this to be a constructive discussion where we aren't interested in only hearing attacks on the other parties and talking points. We'd love to hear your ideas. We'll work together to bring about serious climate action. This entire webinar will be recorded and it will be available afterwards on CAN-Rac's Facebook and YouTube pages. During this event, feel free to join the conversation. Like I said, in the chat and on Twitter, you can use the hashtag Let's Talk Climate. So over to Caro for the first question.
Okay, let's get, on va commencer. Désolée, mon anglais a pris le dessus. Alors, c'est maintenant le temps.
So we're going to start. We're going to go ahead with opening statement. We would like to guide our candidate. Please tell us how your climate plan will give the Canadian a happier, safer, and just life. It is your time to make us dream. Fatima is going to tell you in which order to go ahead with your statement.
Ms. Collins, please go first.
Thanks so much.
Ms. Collins?
I want to first acknowledge that I am zooming in from the homelands of the Lekwungen speaking peoples, the Esquimalt and Songhees First Nations. And I want to thank everyone who's joining the call, and especially thank Climate Action Network for organizing this really important discussion. Over the past year, we have seen record-breaking heat waves, climate fires, extreme weather. You know, this conversation right now is so critical because climate action is so critical. So the NDP is committed to ensuring that we have a bold, ambitious plan that will cut our emissions in half by 2030, ensuring that we stay below 1.5 degree warming. We need to make sure that we are investing in retrofits, in renewables, in transportation mode shift, in all of the climate solutions that we know are so desperately needed. We also need to stop doing a lot of the things that this current government has been doing, including handing out billions of dollars to big oil and gas companies. We need to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies. We also need to stop buying pipelines and spending billions of dollars expanding them. We need to put all of those billions into climate solutions. It is so critically important that we take climate action and that we take climate action with a lens that includes justice for all, and justice for workers, for the communities who are most impacted by the climate crisis, Indigenous communities, racialized communities, low income, communities who are both on the front lines with the impacts, but also have important knowledge and insight and can help guide our path forward. This is so critical that we take climate action. Canadians are tired of empty words and broken promises. We need climate action now.
Thank you, Ms. Collins. Ms. Michaud, over to you.
Merci, bonsoir tout le monde. Merci à Lauren et Caroline pour l'opportunité de parler.
Hi, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk climate with you. I felt very good to know that I could speak in my first language. I'm Kristina Michaud. I am a deputy in Metapedia. I talk for the climate change for Bloc Québécois. I'm an environmentalists, and this is why I chose the blog, because we have a strong point in the climate. We need a strong position. We have ambitious plan, sustainable for Quebec and for the whole Canada to be able to go ahead with a energetic transition. And we definitely need to lower our emission. And for that, we need to go over our targets. We need to do the necessary effort to reach them. And for us, it needs to go against the production of tar sand. We are against this production of petroleum. We know we cannot do this from one day to the other. We must go gradually, but quite rapidly. We want to stop Trans Mountain and take those monies to fund the energetic transition. We have new position. We have a text for all federal policies that would be implemented in the future to measure the impact of those decisions on the environment. We have an idea of green equalization to help the province with the province. And I see that my time is done, so I'll come back to it.
Merci, Ms. Michaud. Mr. Wilkinson, over to you.
Mr. Wilkinson.
Oh, I think you might be muted, sir.
Thank you for the invitation to be here. I want to start by acknowledging that I am located on the unceded ancestral territories of the Squamish, the Musqueam, and the Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. I also want to thank all of those present for the hard work that you all do in your communities. Nous partageons de nombreux objectifs communs. Nous croyons à la science.
We have a common objective. We believe with climate science, the help of the First Nation and the worker. These values are at the heart of our government for environment.
Concrete actions in every sector, in every region. We are using every tool to enable Canada to achieve its more ambitious climate targets. Core to that plan, obviously, is putting a price on pollution at the level required to see net zero as an objective, while returning monies to families to use as they see fit. The price on pollution was recently reaffirmed by the Supreme Court, which is a major victory for all of us. However, precisely because we are driven by science and the urgency of the crisis, we know that more is required. Our platform includes additional measures, including stronger methane regulations, a regulated ramp down of emissions from the oil and gas sector, regulations to require we have 100% non-emitting electricity by 2035, and a ban on the export of thermal coal. The passage of the Net Zero Accountability Act has put the 40 to 45% target into law, which raises questions, I think, for the Conservative Party if it were to form government, given its commitment to roll back Canada's Paris target. In fact, the Paris Agreement requires countries to increase ambition over time. To suggest Canada reduce its target is to reject the core principles of the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement took years worth of consensus building, of negotiation. Mr. O'Toole is indicating he is planning to tear up Canada's contribution to the agreement. And so I guess in closing, I would say directly to my Conservative counterparts that it is absolutely unconscionable, Dan, that your party is working and campaigning on weakening Canada's target. And I think that's a question that you should probably address in this forum.
Thank you, Mr. Wilkinson. Mr. Albas, over to you.
Yes, thank you so much to the Climate Action Network for inviting me today. This is an exciting time for Canada. The Conservative Party has a lot of ideas that we are bringing to the table in this election when it comes to climate change. My leader, Aaron O'Toole, talks often about net zero, the need for us to move towards it. We also have been talking about ESG and how we can see more investment in Canadian, whether that be energy or in clean tech. And also we've been talking about the need to have more Indigenous economic reconciliation. We know that there are many First Nation communities that want to be part of the natural resource sector, but they also want to do it in an environmentally sensitive way. So our Secure the Environment platform was debuted in April so that we could bring it to the Canadian people. We could start having discussions about it. And there's been a great response to it because obviously there is a carbon pricing mechanism in that. We are going to be looking to, as a British Columbia, I'm very excited, not just because there's so many other British Columbians here today, pardon Madame Michaud, but I'm proud of that, but also because we're taking things like a renewable natural gas mandate, a electric vehicle mandate, a low carbon fuel standard, all things that British Columbia does well, but we're going to roll it out as a national mandate. And these ideas will help us to achieve our Paris targets. Now, Mr. Wilkinson would like to have you believe that the new 40% to 45% range, is the Canadian targets. That may be a fact right now. It's something they changed recently, but Canada's never met any of its climate goals. We need to start getting people to work. We also need to be serious about climate. And so we have a plan that will do that. And I'm very excited to talk about it today, while helping more Canadians put food on the table and seeing more Indigenous communities be part of our economic recovery.
Thank you. And last but not least, Mr. Simon.
Yeah, it's Zeman, just.
I'm so sorry, Zeman.
No problem. So the real goal of climate policy is a 100% reduction of new greenhouse gas emissions. It's not 30, not 40, not even 50.
40, c'est même pas 50. C'est pas 20, 15 non plus. Non. Quand on pense à la politique de climat, il faut regarder aussi ce qui a déjà été accumulé. Le net zéro n'élimine pas ce qui a déjà été accumulé.
What's standing in the way of making this possible? Now, some of the slowdown is understandable. Our economies and societies have been shaped around fossil fuels. It's something I've studied as a researcher for 20 years. I know the transition is a huge challenge, but this isn't the only reason things are going slower than they should. Canadian governments haven't made any reductions in emissions since 2005. We're one of the highest per capita emitters in the world. We're at the bottom of the list on climate action. There have been so many promises made, and there'll be more made tonight. We've already heard some of them. They've all been broken. They've been broken by parties in power or who have held the balance of power. Other governments in the world have managed to reduce their emissions drastically, even while growing their economies. So it's clear that it's possible to take action, but somehow Canadians have made it impossible. The Green Party here is the only one serious about climate change. Our policies have been developed around evidence and not gut feelings. We know what happens when you arrive slow to an emergency. We don't intend that to happen to Canada or to Canadians. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your opening statements. We're going to get into our first question, which is going to be about Indigenous rights. Caro?
Yes, merci Fatima. Donc pour le réseau Action Climat,
regarding the questions, the climatic action will only be done only if for example, the Aboriginal groups agree with it. Of course, we are asking all the parties to fulfill the 94 different requests and also do it sincerely, and sincerely also execute what the UN would like to do. What we would like to know from you tonight is how you can now look at the action, the climatic action, and what the Indigenous populations would like. Let me look now at the candidates, and we will start with Mrs. Michaud from the Bloc Québécois. Thank you very much for the question. And we think that regarding the climatic action from the UN and the rights of the indigenous populations is something that for us is extremely important. We've been working with all the national organizations of the indigenous populations, and they actually have agreed at unanimity regarding what needs to be done. And we've been looking at these 94 things which we want, but other governments don't want. And we are asking for everybody, what have you done until now? Because we fully agree with that. So, and when we ask for action, well, it's not only an asking for action, it is doing the action. It's important. And also because the indigenous nations have something which is really unique when they look at the climate, so they fully understand what it is, then this is going to help us to understand the solution, to find the structural solution, and also to reach goals regarding what needs to be done in terms of climate. And of course, this needs to be done in collaboration. And I would like to add that the Bloc Québécois is 100% interested in integrating the work of the indigenous populations with the resolutions of the UN. And we need to be reconciled with the indigenous populations. And we have to look at what they think. Every time we do something, we have to look at what they're interested in. We cannot do the discrimination which has been going on until now. And we have to look at what the rights of the indigenous populations are and then act. Thank you very much, Mrs. Michaud. Now we're going to go to Mrs. Wilkinson. Thank you very much. The reconciliation with the autochthonous, with indigenous populations is something which is part of the policy of the Liberal Party. And we are really interested in all that touches the reconciliation.
Implementation. I am also very pleased to say that the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act received royal assent on June 21st. The act requires the Government of Canada to take all measures necessary to align federal laws with that declaration. We will take a whole of government approach to implementing UNDRIP, including a requirement to implement UNDRIP in the mandate letters of all cabinet ministers. Indigenous peoples are also key partners as we work to protect more of nature, conserve biodiversity, and certainly to combat climate change. Indigenous-led conservation will continue to play a central role in a Liberal government's commitment to conserve 30% of land and marine areas by 2030. We've already invested in and worked actively on 100 Indigenous-led conservation initiatives. In budget 2021, we committed an additional $340 million in new dedicated funding to support Indigenous leadership in nature conservation. Indigenous leadership and perspectives also play a critical role in Canada's work to address climate change. We established bilateral tables with First Nations, with Métis and Inuit partners aimed at building collaborative approaches for engagement with Indigenous peoples in the development and the implementation of the climate plan. In addition, Regional Chief Kluani Adamak and Teresa Bakey, an Inuit leader, were appointed to the Net Zero Advisory Body. A re-elected Liberal government will build on these strong accomplishments and partnerships. We will work with Indigenous leaders to support new Indigenous Guardians programs, to support Indigenous communities to establish more Indigenous conserved and protected spaces, and to advocate for Indigenous rights, in particular regarding land and water stewardship internationally.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Ministre. I'll just do a quick update.
Thank you very much.
Stuff, because I'm seeing a lot of Anglophone comments in the chat about our interpretation. Just a friendly reminder, folks, that if you wish to hear the discussion in English or in French, please click the globe icon at the bottom of your screen and you can choose the language you'll be listening to this discussion in. Just a friendly reminder that the translation is audio. So thank you for that. On va maintenant passer au prochain candidat, Monsieur Szeman.
We are going to start now with the next candidate, Mr. Szeman.
There can be no action on climate change without honoring Indigenous rights in Canada, full stop. The Green Party sees climate action and Indigenous rights as indelibly interlinked. As outlined in our 2021 platform, the development of federal climate policy and just transition programs, programs of environmental justice and ecosystem conservation foregrounds the involvement of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, drawing on their traditional knowledges, wisdom, and connection to this land, to their land. We support Indigenous-led protected and conservation areas and will fund stewardship of these lands and waters and work with the provinces and First Nations to put an immediate halt to the logging of endangered old growth ecosystems, something which current governments seem not to have had much interest in doing, as evidenced by recent events at Fairy Creek. At least they haven't had very much interest in doing this until the election. Just one example of how we see Indigenous people as key to the development of climate policy can be seen in our plan to create an independent, scientific, nonpartisan climate council to advise the government on climate policy on an ongoing basis, which will include First Nations, Inuit, and Métis representation, and youth and representation from communities most affected by the climate emergency. At the beginning of this year, the Green Party proposed an amendment to Bill C-12, the Canadian Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act, which would have created just such an advisory board. But hearings about this amendment were ended before the House could hear testimony from youth, climate scientists, or Indigenous people. Clearly, making certain that Indigenous peoples contribute to climate policy in a meaningful way doesn't seem to be a priority for all Canadian parties. Thanks.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Szeman. On va ensuite passer
Thank you very much, Mr. Szeman. We're now going to the Conservative Party.
Great, thank you so much. Indigenous reconciliation is important to my leader. It's important to my party. It's important to me. And most importantly, it's important to all Canadians who want to see reconciliation. Ever since we saw the discovery of those mass graves, unmarked graves at Kamloops, there's been an outpouring. And I believe that we must honor and listen to Indigenous voices. I joined the debates that happened, and I raised the voices of people in my area, like Chief Harvey McLeod, who was a survivor himself of that school. And it's important for us to continue to work in partnership. I've talked earlier about natural resource development, but also there are clean tech and other environmental initiatives that First Nations would like to partner with. And that's something that the Conservative Party we want to do. My leader's first question as the new leader of the official opposition in the House of Commons was on reconciliation. This is an incredibly important thing. We need to have all levels of government. We need to have all stratas of Canadian society look to the 94 calls to action done by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We know that those calls to action 71 through 76, we need to do immediately, and we need to have better mechanisms to work with First Nations so we keep prioritizing and keeping those calls to action on the top of the federal government's mind. My leader has also retained a special advisor on UNDRIP, and we will work with other parliamentarians, and we will work with First Nations directly in order to facilitate reconciliation on Indigenous communities' terms. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Albas. Et finalement,
finally, we're going to go to Collins from the NDP.
Thanks so much. And upholding Indigenous rights is essential if we want to be effective in climate action, and it is essential if we want environmental justice. Indigenous communities are the original stewards of their territories, and they are best placed to protect the cultural and biological diversity through control of their own territories. New Democrats are committed to fully implementing the 94 calls to action in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, also fully implementing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And we are going to put reconciliation at the heart of our approach to addressing the climate crisis. First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities must be full and equal partners in our path to a low carbon future. And it means ensuring that Indigenous leadership is at the table, at the high level decision-making tables, and actually involved in directing Canada's efforts to confront the climate crisis. It also means making sure there are opportunities for renewable energy projects and sustainable energy in remote communities. It means expanding the Indigenous Guardian program, investing in Indigenous-led stewardship, investing in Indigenous-led science, and the creation of Indigenous-managed protected areas. We are going to ensure that our recovery efforts for species at risk respect Indigenous rights and embrace traditional knowledge, that we are protecting and restoring the wild Pacific salmon populations here on the West Coast. Indigenous communities are not only stewards of their territories, they're also on the front lines and disproportionately impacted by the climate crisis. So we need to make sure that we take a fundamentally different approach to our future, and one that recognizes Indigenous rights, that upholds Indigenous rights, and recognizes the knowledge and respects Indigenous sovereignty.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Collins.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Collins.
we're still getting lots of comments about the translation and interpretation in the chat. A reminder to all of our speakers and to me and my co-moderator to speak slowly so the interpretation is as audible as possible. And a reminder to participants that there are real people doing interpretation live as we're speaking. It's a really tough job, so please be understanding. Thanks.
So my first follow-up question is for Ms. Collins from the NDP. It's great to hear all of you make commitments to include Indigenous voices and Indigenous decision-making in climate action policies in the future. But Ms. Collins, in the past, NDP leader Jagmeet Singh has expressed support for the Coastal GasLink LNG project, which faces opposition from the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs. What's the party's current position on this project?
When Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs were calling on this prime minister to meet with them, Jagmeet stood up in the House of Commons and echoed those calls, asking the prime minister to meet with the hereditary leadership. Since then, he has been in the House of Commons, in the media. He has said that fracking must be part of our past. It cannot be part of our future. We need to rapidly transition away from fossil fuels, and we need to make sure that we are listening to the voices of Indigenous peoples.
Merci, Madame Collins. Prochaine question pour Monsieur Albas. Vous parlez.
Thank you, Madame Collins. Monsieur Albas, so you talk about financial reconciliation on your platform. And we also see a proposition to push a bill to protect essential infrastructure that would prevent protesters from blocking key infrastructure when we know these protesters are historically largely Indigenous, protecting their rights and territories.
Thank you. Thanks for the question. It's really important that we get a balance right in Canada. People have a right to protest. They have a right to hear or to say what is on their minds, and they should be listened to. Right now, we see more division in this country because of the way that the Trudeau government talks and doesn't listen. We need to change this. In some cases, there are provincial governments like the pipeline that Ms. Collins was mentioning that's governed through the province of British Columbia. But there should always be avenues for people to speak with elected officials. That's something that I try to do. But at the same token, we always have to have a balance of where someone can express themselves, but to do so safely, where it doesn't jeopardize the safety of the protesters or the safety of other people. So we will try to get that balance. We will trust and work with the authorities, particularly the courts, to make sure that our laws are just and fair to all. And we will make sure that that balance is maintained.
Our last follow-up question in this portion of the conversation goes to Mr. Wilkinson. A simple yes or no, I guess. Does consultation and consent with Indigenous people include the right to say no?
Well, we went through quite a long process of what consultation and accommodation means associated with the Trans Mountain Pipeline. As you will know, the courts essentially said initially that the Crown had not fully discharged its requirement to consult and accommodate. And so there was quite a long period of time where the government reached out in a number of different areas and was guided by one of the justices of the former justice of the Supreme Court in terms of doing that, and worked very hard to try to not only consult, but to accommodate as much as possible. That is the duty of the Crown. And I think in law, it's now been pretty well documented in terms of what is required. It's certainly a lot more than a box checking exercise. There is an enormous amount of work that has to be done to ensure that you have fully discharged the duty to consult and to accommodate.
Thank you. We're now going to move on to our second topic. This will be about the oil and gas sector. A recent report published in the leading journal Nature tells us that nearly 60% of oil and fossil fuel and methane gas and 90% of coal must remain unextracted to keep within a 1.5 degrees Celsius carbon budget. Earlier this summer, the International Energy Agency issued a landmark report which found that in order to have a chance of meeting a global net zero by 2050, the world will no longer tolerate any investment in new fossil fuel supply projects. How does your party respond to the science and the global call for a phase out of fossil fuels, including coal, oil, and gas? We will start with, my apologies, my Google Doc is being weird. Once it sorts itself out, we're going to start with Mr. Wilkinson.
Okay, thank you for the question. The climate science is pretty clear. Eliminating the use of thermal coal is a critical first step towards the achievement of the Paris goals. The oil and gas sector, though, must also make real progress in reducing emissions on a pathway to net zero by 2050. When we took office in 2015, Canada's emissions were projected to be 12% higher in 2030 than they were in 2005. Since then, we have broken the upward trajectory of those emissions, and Canada's emissions right now are 1% lower, and they are projected to fall every year between now and 2030. Canada's Paris Agreement emissions reduction target is 40 to 45%. That is what is filed with the United Nations. Our Strengthened Climate Plan, coupled with measures that are contained in the campaign platform, will enable us to achieve that target. Expert assessments of the climate plan, including the recent assessment by Professor Jacquard at SFU, demonstrate that we're on track to achieve Canada's strengthened target. En ce qui concerne le charbon, nous avions précédemment exigé l'élimination.
For the carbon, we asked to slowly oh my God. We want to stop the exportation of carbon.
2005, and they now make up 26% of Canada's emissions. We must see significant reductions in oil and gas emissions as part of any credible climate plan. Our platform commits to capping emissions on the oil and gas sector and requiring 5-year binding reduction targets aligned with achieving net zero by 2050. We will set the 2025 and 2030 targets based on advice from the Net Zero Advisory Body, a group of experts that includes your former executive director of your organization, Catherine Abreu. Other relevant measures in our platform include accelerating our G20 commitment to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies and phasing out public financing of the fossil fuel sector, including crown corporations like Export Development Canada. The bottom line is that the oil and gas sector needs to contribute its share to Canada's climate effort.
Thank you, Mr. Wilkinson. Mr. Albas.
Great, thank you so much for the question. There are many opportunities that Canada can have to lower emissions at home and abroad. We certainly can simply see the amount of investment that has left this country since the Trudeau government has taken office. And so right now, many energy companies are not planning new projects. So what we have to ask ourselves is that how do we work with the energy sector to lower the emissions that are there? One of the things that's in our platform is that if someone has a project that can lower emissions, we will fast track that. That's an exceptionally important thing. But Mr. Wilkinson talked about banning the export of thermal coal. Most of the coal that is exported out of Canada is actually American. It will simply just go through different ports. And so if we're going to make a difference as a country in the elimination of the use of coal, we need to give the world an opportunity to change. So we do have LNG, liquefied natural gas. We can utilize renewable energy sources such as hydro to have some of the cleanest liquefied natural gas and export that to displace coal-powered electricity. There are ways that we can help to see new investments, to lower emissions, to include Indigenous communities, and that's by working with provinces. One of the other things that's in the Liberal platform that I think it's important to ask the question of is they said they're going to cap emissions from the energy sector. I don't believe the Constitution works that way. So maybe Mr. Wilkinson can back up how exactly he's going to do that. I think it's important that all of us recognize that climate change is an all hands on deck approach, and we need to deal with our emissions both at home and abroad while giving people the chance to put food on the table, include Indigenous communities as part of economic reconciliation.
Mr. Szeman.
All right, just before I begin, I'd ask Mr. Wilkinson to read my response to Mr. Jacquard's article in Policy Options. It certainly helps one's position to read only what one likes, and the Liberal Party has been doing that without looking at any of the other critiques of that particular position. So let me also provide a clarification and some context. The figures provided by Nature actually give higher figures for Canada. The report states that 83% of this country's oil reserves, 81% of its gas, 83% of its coal will have to stay in the ground to achieve our climate targets. It's not the 60% that the question asks. I also want to give some comments, some context about the IEA. It was established by the OECD in the wake of the '73 oil crisis, and it was tasked with providing data to member states on oil markets, which means, really, if the IEA says that fossil fuels have to stay in the ground, then we can be sure that they have to stay. I feel that neither Mr. Albas or Mr. Wilkinson really wanted to answer your question. They wanted to avoid the elephant in the climate policy room, and that is fossil fuels. Given the figures that I just gave you, we have to end the production of fossil fuels in Canada. We have to end new projects, and we have to bring an end to existing oil and gas operations on a declining basis until they're phased out between 2030 and 2035. This is based on evidence-based research about emissions targets. And I don't see any other way we can do this. I know that some have offered solutions such as carbon capture or blue hydrogen. They're both techno-utopian ideals. At present, carbon capture manages to address about 0.1% of emissions. And blue hydrogen, according to researchers at Cornell and Stanford, it's more than 20% greater than burning either natural gas or coal directly. The fossil fuel era is over. It's time to get on with Canada's energy future. Anything else is just trying to, stay the inevitable. Thanks.
Ms. Michaud.
Merci. Je comprends qu'il y a un enjeu de traduction, donc je vais tenter de parler.
I understand that there is an issue with the translation, but 2 minutes pass so fast. Science is clear. And at the Bloc, we believe with science. We know we have to diminish our emission. We need to change our way to do. We need to decarbonize our economy. And Canada is exported petroleum, but we have hydroelectricity in Quebec, wind, solar, and we can put all those sustainable energy to profit instead of taking the money of the Canadian into fossil fuel. I don't think it's responsible to spend that money. So for us, it's clear to have an energetic path that will keep the temperature lower than 1.5 degrees. And for this, we need to get away from tar sand. If we want to reach the goal of zero net in 2050, we need to have clear steps, clear action to get there. So any project like a Trans Mountain, we need to speak clearly against those projects. And I believe that Quebec and all province are not energetic corridor. We have beautiful rivers. We have Great Lakes. We do not want to put them in perils with those that pollution. So we have a clear position for Bloc Québécois, and we're honest. Every party should have an honest proposition. We know that the most pollution comes from gas and petroleum, so we need to transition to more sustainable and green energy. It should have been done long ago, but now it's time or never.
Finally, Ms. Collins.
Thanks so much. And we need to stop creating new fossil fuel infrastructure. The IPCC has issued a code red for humanity. They are telling us that we need to cut our emissions globally in half by 2030. And there's no way to do that if we are continuing to expand new fossil fuel infrastructure. We need to follow the science. And it is disappointing to see this government setting targets that are below what the top global scientists are telling us will be necessary, and then saying that we're on track to meeting those targets when today Climate Tracker showed how actually our record and our commitments are highly insufficient, that we're actually on track to a global warming of 4 degrees. And that is devastating. That would mean some of the most catastrophic impacts of the climate crisis. We need our government to actually do what it says. The promises to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies are so essential. We are handing over billions of dollars to big oil and gas companies. We are actually fueling the climate crisis. And every time I hear this government say they are committed to phasing out fossil fuel subsidies, they are committed to ending fossil fuel subsidies, I want to hold up the record. The record is that we have increased our fossil fuel subsidies every year, and on average, $900 million. We need to stop funding the climate crisis and start funding the solutions, the climate solutions. We, as New Democrats, are committed to tackling the climate crisis, to eliminating fossil fuel subsidies, to cutting emissions by more than half by 2030, and to also create hundreds of thousands of jobs in the low carbon economy. We need a just transition for workers. We need to actually invest in the future. And it is the future for ourselves, for our children, for our grandchildren. This is so essential. We need climate action now.
Thank you all for your responses. We're going to try and do some more follow-up questions again to understand how each of your parties are actually going to phase out oil and gas, as you've all committed to just now. So first question to Carol.
Merci, Fatima.
Thank you very much. We look now at what the minister told us, and they told us that if you look at the Trans Mountain and the expansion could now go on for 30 to 40 years. And therefore, this is part of the liberal platform where they put now ceiling this kind of expansion. Does this mean that this new mechanism is actually something which will be blocking the production export of oil from Canada?
You're directing, the translation was difficult, and then I switched to yours, so I'm not sure I caught all of it, but that was for me or it was for Mr. Albas?
Pour vous.
This was a question for you.
Okay, so clearly, in order to achieve net zero, just from a logical perspective, you have to make reductions across the piece, every sector, and that's every sector with emissions, whether that's agriculture or it's steel or it's buildings, it's electricity generation, and certainly in this country, the 2 largest sources of emissions are the oil and gas sector and transportation. And of course, those emissions are linked because the primary use of oil is actually as gasoline and diesel fuel. So the focus has to be on driving emissions down. In the oil and gas sector, the way in which the cap and the binding reductions work is it will force reductions both over time in emissions intensity and in production. There's no way to get to net zero by 2050 in the oil and gas space if you're not actually looking at both of those levers. But it's the same thing is true in all of the different sectors, and part of that's about reducing demand, right? I mean, we are one of the most ambitious in the world with respect to transportation, saying that we will not allow internal combustion engines to be sold as light-duty vehicles after 2035. It'll be 100% zero-emission vehicles. That will have a major impact on demand for oil and gas. I mean, that is actually true for the Conservative Party, except that their number is 30% of vehicles being zero emission by then. That will also have an effect on demand for oil. So absolutely, we have to be looking to drive down emissions. Part of that is through driving down demand, and part of that is actually working to ensure that the sector itself is making progress on an ongoing basis.
Thank you, Mr. Wilkinson. My follow-up question is for Mr. Albas. Your party's platform promises to undo the changes ushered in by Bill C-69, which modernized how Canada reviews major resource projects And your party also promises to repeal Bill C-48, which banned oil tankers on BC's north coast. And if repealed, could reopen the door to the Enbridge Northern Gateway oil sands pipeline. Your party has also promised to make oil export pipelines a priority and implement a federal LNG export strategy. Critics looking at this are worried that you've got a lot of focus on oil and gas, which the science says that we need to take away from and reduce, like the original question was, to phase out oil and gas. How do you respond to this? How do we meet our targets if we're also doing all the things that your party is proposing with oil and gas?
I think we have to look at the reality that today we do have a lot of people that use internal combustion engines. There are shortages of electric vehicles right across the country. The government has not put a focus on that. We believe that we will take the model used in British Columbia that's been very successful. BC has some of the highest adoption of electric vehicles, and we'll put that right across the country. Unfortunately, the Liberals just have let this one slide. What we are also talking about, though, is with Indigenous communities. For example, Todd Doherty, the member of parliament for that area, I met with chiefs and representations from First Nations in the area that were affected by C-48, and they told they were not even consulted. This government likes to do things by the stroke of a pen. It doesn't like to actually work with First Nations and to try and find that balance. For example, we'd like to see more Indigenous involvement in energy projects and from all different types. We also want to see red tape from, if someone wants to put in new technology to lower the footprint of existing oil and gas, or propose a new one that significantly reduces emission. There's negative emissions technology. We have money in our budget for the use, the study of modular reactors. Those things are the way that we can balance seeing jobs at the same time lowering emissions from the oil sands and other parts of the energy sector. It's finding the balance, not just writing off communities, nor ignoring that the new technologies that are coming out could be a big advantage to Canada, and we can do a lot working with provinces and territories, not the way that this government has. I find, quite honestly, Mr. Wilkinson is a nice man, but quite honestly, I think his government treats provinces more like punching bags than partners, and we need all hands on deck.
Merci, Monsieur Albas. Une dernière
question. Thank you, Mr. Albert. Last question to Mrs. Collins. In spite of the fact of what has been done regarding the thermic problems in Canada, we're exporting as much coal, Canadian coal, so thermal coal, which is now burnt abroad in order to produce electricity. Both the Liberals and the Greens in their platform state very clearly that they have to do something about it. And you, what do you say so that we can end the export to thermal coal?
Absolutely. We need to eliminate the export of thermal coal. And I'm not 100% sure I caught the entire translation, but New Democrats are committed to ensuring that we end the export of thermal coal. Coal is one of the dirtiest fossil fuels. We should not be producing new coal mines here in Canada. My colleague, Heather McPherson, has been a champion when it comes to fighting against the proposed coal mines in Alberta. It is unbelievable to me that we would ever approve. And I do want to give some credit to the minister for actually finally saying that these coal mines would need federal approval and for stopping doing them. When it comes to thermal coal, this should be a no-brainer. It is the lowest hanging fruit.
Thank you so much. We're now going to move on to our next question, which is going to be about just transition, and Carol's going to ask.
Merci beaucoup, Fatima. Merci.
Thank you very much, Fatima. Thank you very much, my dear candidates, for your answers. We have the last few weeks, we have looked at how your parties now are trying to help the workers, for example, out west, And regarding, based on a report, a recent report, if you look now at the people working this kind of domains, we have seen that there's been a decrease of by 17% of the money that these families have been getting. This also means that it was done because of the climate imperative, but it is also something that was done because the investments in these sectors was done also at the world level. It's not something which is only touching Canada. This also means that we now need to look at this just transition, which needs to be done together. So we go for the whole process and all the mechanisms. And we also have to look at the related financements and investments. This also means that we need to start with the Minister Wilkins.
Okay, thanks. I guess I get to go first a lot. Look, I don't think you're going to find a lot of differences amongst all of the parties in saying that workers and communities must be supported as we move through an energy transition. That is critically important for any federal government of any political stripe, in the sense that it is not a responsible position for any federal government to say that they do not care about some region of the country. We all have to be thoughtful about ensuring there's economic opportunity for families that live in every region of this country. When we talk about the just transition, I think it's really critical that we talk about what we mean by that. And I think what we mean by that are two things. One is economic diversification that will create jobs. And the second is supports for skills training to ensure that people can make the transition, as the economy itself makes the transition. We have done this before with coal, workers who were involved in communities that actually dealt with coal. We worked through a just transition process with a committee that actually went around the country that included industry and labor, Indigenous peoples, to try to develop pathways for that kind of diversification and skills training to enable workers to move forward. That is certainly something that we need to do here. We made significant investments in skills training in the last budget. We had $1.5 billion for a biofuels fund that is an opportunity from the agricultural perspective, but also from the processing perspective. Our platform has a $2 billion fund for Alberta, Saskatchewan, Newfoundland, and Labrador to help to think through how we would best diversify those economies that would need to include workers and unions and educational institutions and industry and environmental organizations. And certainly we need to ensure that those are tailored regionally. We have committed to put in place a Clean Jobs Training Center that would help to upgrade workers. And we are out consulting right now on the development of a Just Transition Act, which is something that we committed to do, that we will be bringing forward. At the end of the day, it is really important that we work on this. Obviously, it is best if we can coordinate our efforts with provincial governments, and we will endeavor certainly to do that on an ongoing basis. But with respect to climate action and a little bit in response to Mr. Albas, I mean, it is important to work, and certainly the work we've done with Quebec and BC shows how you can accelerate climate action if you work constructively together. But you have to actually work constructively together. Alberta and Saskatchewan at this point don't even have a climate target. I mean, Premier Moe just put a tax on electric vehicles. I mean, at a certain point, we actually do need everybody at all levels to get serious about climate action.
Merci, Monsieur le Ministre. On va maintenant passer.
Thank you much, Monsieur le Ministre. Ms. Michaud from Bloc Québécois. Yes, it is very clear that we want to be in solidarity with the Western workers, and we want to make sure they understand what's going on, and all the money which is placed in the oil industry and so forth. Well, we should be putting it in the transition in order to develop new technologies. And it's actually in the name of this transition that we have agreed that we can now help the transition. Well, we're showing the solidarity with them. And we think that these jobs, in this case, in my region at least, perhaps all over Quebec, it could also be possible across Canada, that there is not enough workers. And that's exactly why the solution for the companies is to look at the productivity thanks to new technology, thanks to the organization. And thus, if you now look at what has been proposed. We're not opposing at all, not at all. We are proposing that perhaps the NPD and the liberals have a law, I think, the 111, that states that there's some experts and the proposition should be passing. We would be there at the table so that we can have a committee which will be discussing it, and the bloc is has some very nice green propositions, motions, which are very positive regarding what is durable, and the hydrogen, what is green, what is now produced thanks to the water, through the hydrogen as well. And if you now look at all the emissions, which need to be green emissions, so that we make sure that what has been financed is financed in this way. So, of course, we show solidarity with the West, but we also solidarity with everybody else. Mrs. Michaud, we are now going to go to Mr. Szeman.
All right, thank you very much. I have to also make a comment at the beginning, and that is that Ms. Collins always discusses the government as if the NDP was separate from it. I had thought her party held the balance of power, and so she could have influenced, climate policy in her role, and her party could have as well. But perhaps I'm missing something, and I can be corrected about that. I think Mr. Wilkinson is right. All of us are going to have versions of a transition strategy. So in the interest of keeping things a bit shorter and going slower for the translators, let me turn to the part of the question that I haven't heard anybody talk about yet. And that's this, the creation of a transition advisory council. So in our platform, we state explicitly that those most impacted by energy transition, which will include workers in greenhouse gas intensive industries, but also Indigenous people and marginalized communities, that these people would play a lead role in the preparation of their transition strategies. And unions would certainly be important partners in this, even if unionization has been stifled by industry in fossil fuel industries. Unifor, Canada's biggest private sector union, which has 12,000 members working in the oil and gas industry, they've indicated their support of a just transition program away from oil and gas, and other unions have as well. And Uniform's also agreed that Canada should reduce its emissions by 60% of its 2005 levels, precisely the levels to which the Green Party has committed. Now, my late father worked in the fossil fuel industry his entire life. I'm originally from Alberta, though I'm in BC right now. He wasn't committed to the industry in a way I think a lot of the image of what oil workers in Alberta are, like that's everything to them. What he wanted was fair and well-paid work.
Merci,
and
all
right, thanks very much.
Merci, désolé, on doit vous couper. On passe maintenant.
Sorry, I have to cut you. We're going to go to Mr. Albert.
Sorry, I wasn't sure if it was my turn, but so thank you for the question. So first of all, we've talked a little bit about this government's approach to working with provinces. Remember that the original targets that were taken to Paris by this government were negotiated with all provinces and territories. It was what each province agreed to. We've seen this government suddenly raise those targets without ever actually having put a dent in greenhouse gas emissions. And provinces have many of the most important levers when it comes to climate change. So everything from transportation, energy, natural resource development, housing, agriculture, there are so many elements there. And this government just has failed to work with provinces on instituting any kind of organized plan. So we give from Ottawa, there's billions of dollars every year that are given to provinces for retraining funds. And there it is a very sloppy job done by this government. They have not actually helped people to transition into new important careers because there has been a lot of unemployment since 2015, particularly in the prairie provinces that depend on the energy sector. And the government has put together a greener homes initiative But guess what? People try to see if they can access it, but they can't find anyone that has the qualifications for energy efficiency and evaluation. So the government keeps trying to say that it's doing all the right things, but we see billions of dollars that are not going towards helping people today. Now, I do agree with Mr. Wilkinson that we have a responsibility to work with the provinces, because ultimately it's their responsibility for skills and training, but we got to stop hitting them and treating provinces divisively. He's spoken a number of times against certain premiers. That's not how you get things done. We'll do better. Thank you.
On va maintenant terminer avec Madame Collins.
We will end with Madame Collins.
First, I just want to respond to Mr. Zeman's question about how the Parliament worked over the past 2 years. The Liberals had the NDP, the Conservatives, and the Bloc holding the balance of power. So they could choose and see who supported them, which makes it, I think, in my opinion, even more impressive how we were able to strengthen their net zero legislation, get more support for people through the pandemic. But to the question, we need to make sure that the workers who are most impacted by the changes in our economy do not pay the price for inaction on the climate crisis. And we are committed to working with workers, unions, employers, and provinces and territories to ensure that we have the solutions for a just transition, and that we have a transition that leaves no one behind. So whether we are forming government or holding the balance of power, I will fight to ensure we have an independent advisory council on the just transition, but also that we have concrete actions to support workers. And it is interesting to hear the minister talking about a just transition, because in Parliament, none of the ministers for the past 2 years have even said the words just transition, not once. And so, in the past year, it has only been, just in 2020 alone, it's only been the Green Party and the NDP who even said the words just transition. The Bloc had said it earlier in 2020. But why are the ministers responsible not even using the words just transition if they are committed, and then days before an election?
Merci, Madame Collins. Je passe la parole à Fatima pour...
Now, Fatima, we'll go ahead with follow-up questions.
My first follow-up question is for Mr. Zeman. You
Monsieur
say
Zeman,
in the Green Platform that
que sur votre plateforme,
you will replace every fossil fuel job with green sector jobs.
Remplacer les emplois pétrole avec des emplois verts. C'est quoi ces emplois-là et qu'est-ce que vous allez faire?
Et replacement of fossil fuel sector jobs, they often imagine that it has to go into a renewable energy job. And that, I think, is where one of the errors is. The jobs can be located across all sectors. And the mechanisms will do that is by training and also providing a fund in order to enable this, both in terms of training, but also in job creation. And also there'll be a green fund to enable specific transitions of all sectors of the industry towards a more green economy.
Merci, Monsieur Simon. Prochaine question de suivi.
Thank you, Mr. Simon. Next question for Madame Michaud. Your party have a proposition of a green equalization. She would give more money for provinces who do better, reducing their emission, like Quebec. So how such a formula would support workers of the provinces who produces gas and oil? Thank you for that. The equalization, fair question, it's the principle of the polluter payer. So the provinces who are better players, like Quebec, who produce less than the Canadian average and GES, could receive an amount paid by those who produce more. So it's an incentive to produce less. We use the expression that we can do both things at the same thing. This is not the only solution. We can change our way to invest, stops the subsidies for oil and gas, and to use it in the energetic transition, green transition, and support the workers who are from the West and the producers province. So there are many ways to support those workers, and mainly by stop subsidizing those industries.
Thank you so much. We're going to move on to our next section, which is going to be about leaving no one behind. As we all know, the effects of climate change are felt first and most violently by those in communities that are marginalized. That includes Indigenous peoples, people of color, those with disabilities, people in lower income brackets who struggle financially, and those living in developing countries. The list goes on. What are your party's strategies for adaptation for the most vulnerable communities? We'll start with Mr. Albas.
Great, thank you very much. Karl Popper was a philosopher of science, and he spoke about something called reverse utilitarianism, which instead of focusing on policies that make everyone as happy as possible, you instead focus on those that are suffering the most. So you target help for those that are needed, where help is needed. So again, we want to make sure that people have safe drinking water right across this country. The Liberals have not done that. We also want to ensure that Indigenous reconciliation happens on their terms. And so, as I've said, I've worked on, and many of our members have worked on, advocating for projects, whether they be on the natural resource or renewable energy side. And those things should continue. We've also talked in our platform for Canada's recovery plan, the needs to have it to unleash some of the tight rules around international assistance. Right now, a Canadian charity operating in a foreign country has to show they have complete control over everything. And oftentimes in those countries, that's not how it works there. They need to partner with other agencies on the ground. So we are going to work to try to listen, to work with people on their challenges and try and get better results while getting, and again, results is the key point. I think everyone knows that Mr. Trudeau will often look at you, hand on his heart, and say, I promise I will plant 2 billion trees. I promise I will work on a just transition. And as Ms. Collins has remarked, they don't then talk about those after. We need a government that will actually say what it'll do and then do it.
Thank you so much, Mr. Szeman.
Sorry about that. I'm going to speak to Canada's international commitments with this question. Greenhouse gases don't stop at national borders. They don't need a passport to get into Canada, or our emissions don't need a passport to get into other countries. As one of the world's highest per capita emitters of greenhouse gases, Canada has a responsibility to support the climate action efforts of other countries and to attend to the energy poverty and disproportionate impacts of climate change. The numbers that have been put out there by other parties, whether it's 30% or 40% or 50% for domestic reductions, are only part of the story. And I must admit to still being confused where these figures come from, since I can't see that they're based on research or science. The Green Party is going to develop its climate policy in order to fulfill its existing commitments to international climate change efforts. We'll submit a revised nationally determined contribution to the Paris Agreement that reflects our fair share of emissions reductions while ramping up climate finance to $4 billion US per year to support climate mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage in developed countries. We'll also invest in green infrastructure in developing countries to offset energy poverty. The rich and wealthy of this world have already benefited from their disproportionate access to energy. They now have an ethical obligation to address the consequences of fossil fuel use and to ensure that developing countries have access to adequate supplies of energy to improve the lives of individuals and communities within their borders. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Michaud.
Merci. Comme dans tout, c'est toujours un peu les plus vulnérables qui sont
It's always the most vulnerable that are touched first. And in Quebec, there's something interesting that exists. It's the right to live in a healthy environment. It's there in our charter. And we would love to have a similar law in Canadian law and environment. I think it could have a symbolic way to go forward for environmental justice. One of the best ways to fight is to defend these environmental sovereignty of the territory, whether for First Nation or any province. Climate change affects human health. So I think that environmental justice is a great way to fight, and we need to take care of our people, take care of their health. We know that health is managed by the province. So for us, it's essential to have the right monies. It's essential to have money for health and environmental justice, and to transfer this 28 billion for the Quebec and other provinces. If not, Canada has a great role to play in international scene, could have a higher envelope for development. Things had been proposed at the UN to help international aid, looking at the
Thank you so much. Ms. Collins.
Thank you. And far too often, the impacts of climate change are disproportionately borne by marginalized communities. And so an NDP government would ensure that investments are directed towards reducing inequality, to honoring and upholding Indigenous rights, and to supporting communities that have been left behind by consecutive Liberal and Conservative governments. We absolutely need to increase our climate financing globally, but we also need to make sure that we are investing in and supporting communities here in Canada who are experiencing record-breaking heat waves, climate fires, flooding. We have committed to creating an Office of Environmental Justice to address the disproportionate impacts of pollution and loss of biodiversity on low-income, racialized, and other marginalized communities. One of the reasons I got into politics is because of the climate crisis. And the reason I chose the NDP is because I saw only in this party a commitment to the interconnection between environmental justice and social justice. And it is so essential that we move forward and ensure that no one is left behind.
Thank you so much. And Mr. Wilkinson, you go last this time.
Well, thank you. So I actually agree with a lot of the things that both Kristina and Laurel and Imre said. Hope I got that right. So environmental justice is certainly bigger than climate. It's a broader subject, and there are definitely both international and domestic kind of lenses on this. Au niveau international, nous nous sommes récemment engagés à doubler notre engagement en matière de financement climatique pour apporter à 5 milliards de dollars.
And we actually, when they
so, the funds that we have committed, the doubling of international climate funds, are focused on addressing the challenges faced by developing countries. That's not just adaptation, it's also mitigation, but it's certainly also a focus on the protection of biodiversity around the world. Canada was actually recently asked to co-lead the corralling of the $100 billion commitment that the developed world made to the developing world as part of the deal that was done at Paris. We were asked to co-lead this by the international community with Germany. And so we are working very actively on that, but I think it's a recognition of the important and significant role that Canada is increasingly playing in the climate field internationally. Beyond international action, obviously, we need to be thinking about environmental justice within this country. There was a bill that was actually introduced into Parliament in the last Parliament. It was actually sponsored by a private member named Lenore Zan. The focus was on looking at sort of the disproportionate impacts on Indigenous communities and focusing on requiring the Minister of the Environment, whoever that is in the future, to examine the links between race and socioeconomic status and exposure to environmental risk. The other thing that we did, and we will do again, is we introduced into Parliament a modernization of the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. And one element of that was included for the first time in Canadian law was the right to a healthy environment, which again focuses very much on the disproportionate impacts on vulnerable populations. And so those issues around environmental justice are really important, and they will need to continue to be a priority for us as we move forward.
Thank you so much. We'll have 2 follow-up questions, starting with Carol.
Merci, Fatima.
Thank you, Fatima. We're now going to go to Ms. Michaud. What is the role of the Bloc Québécois when we look at the transfers regarding health? We know what the Bloc has to say about that and about the jurisdiction in general. What are the national standards? So what do you think now? What is the position of the Bloc regarding the national problem, this climate problem, environment problem, when we look at the law which has been now proposed on the topic of the climate and the environment? This is a very good question. Bloc is okay, is actually favorable. They like, we already said, that for us it's very important to look at we fully agree that we fully agree with the fact that we respect what belongs to different territories and the provinces. And I have to repeat that when we look at this climate problem, we have to look at the solution. All solutions are welcome, and we have to look at the project which has been deposed. And I think it should be proposed again, because we have a few things to say about that law, and we're fully open to work with it, actually modify it as well in beta. And it is a topic which is going to be very important when we fight the climate change. We're very interested in that.
Thank you so much. My follow-up question is for Mr. Albas. Part of adaptation strategies includes nature-based solutions. The Conservative Party has not committed to the 30% land and ocean protection goals that we've seen others commit to by 2030. There's very little in the platform about nature-based solutions. And I'm wondering if you can address that and tell us what the plan is for the Conservatives in this regard.
Yes, I'd be happy to. So I've actually held the Minister to account a committee in regards to this. And to be fair, the commitment of 30% by 2030 is the largest amount of conservation in the history of Canada. And so the amount of lands and making sure that it is done right is something that Parliament needs to do. Unfortunately, the Minister has been very opaque on that. Now, in regards to nature-based solutions, we actually have a section of Secure the Environment where we'll say we'll invest $3 billion in nature-based solutions. And part of that is to deal with if someone wants to use wetlands as a way to store carbon, at the same time deal with flood mitigation, or perhaps to deal with drought situations. That is something that we will absolutely support. We also want to work with ranchers, with farmers and foresters, and we'll make sure that that there are funds available to conserve those things. We also want to see Indigenous protected and conservation areas. We want to see more Indigenous guardian programs go up. Oftentimes the government, will say, or a First Nation band will say, we've conserved this area, but we have no funds to actually improve the habitat. This government has done a very poor job on talking about adaptation and resiliency. This is something that we will invest in. And again, you can count on a Conservative government to perform and get results.
Thank you so much for your response. So we're almost at the end of this session, and this is the part where a normal conversation would have closing statements. We've decided to switch it up. I'm going to ask each of the candidates one question about something in their platform or their policy, and they're going to respond hopefully in just over a minute, because we're tight on time, and we'll see how it goes. So my first question is for Mr. Szeman. In recent months, while Canada was dealing with deadly wildfires and extreme weather fueled by climate change, the Green Party was consumed by infighting. How can voters be sure that if elected into office, Green MPs will be focused on your party's core issue?
Internal disputes around leaders are endemic to Canadian politics. Does anybody remember Andrew Scheer, for instance, or Stéphane Dion? It doesn't take away from a party's mission and a party's core values. The Green Party is committed to environmental change, to climate policy, to social justice. It's all laid out in our platform. It's something that's been part of the policy of the party from the very beginning. Our policies on climate are the most ambitious ones that are out there in this election. And yet they're only ambitious in the context of Canada. Other countries have done the same as we're suggesting. 60% is what is now suggested by organizations like your own as what we have to move towards in order to hit IPCC targets. The Green Party is committed to doing that. Whether or not we have internal issues, we are going to fight to make this happen. And we have to make it happen because there's no other choice. The other parties, I'm afraid,
thank you so much, Mr. Szeman. Sorry to
are not doing the work they need to do.
Thank you. Ms. Collins, experts say that your climate plan lacks serious detail or pathways. How do you balance being tough on climate change without wiping out entire industries or seeing jobs move overseas?
You know, the experts that Mr. Wilkinson was referring to, Mark Jacquard, you know, I don't think he actually clearly read our platform. We not only have a price on carbon, but we don't actually consider that a silver bullet. We are going to need so much more. We have details about the concrete steps that we are taking, including transportation mode shift, including investing in renewables, including making sure that we retrofit all of our buildings and move to zero emission vehicles, electrifying transit. We have a bold, ambitious plan to tackle the climate crisis. And unlike this Liberal government, we won't just talk about the actions, we'll actually do them. You know, right now we are in a climate emergency, and Canadians want a government that doesn't just make promises, but one that delivers on them. We need to do this for our children, for our grandchildren, and for future generations.
Thank you. My next question is for Mr. Albas. It took 3 years for the Liberal government to introduce carbon pricing. If elected, how long will it take for the Conservatives to set up a low carbon savings account?
Well, thank you very much for the question. So Mr. O'Toole is already committed to meeting with every premier to talk about this. Some premiers may say we have a better carbon price a mousetrap, and so we'll work with them on those things. But this is important to have all of these things, whether it be renewable natural gas mandate, a low carbon fuel standard, an electric vehicle mandate. There's many things that I think many of the other parties here would support. So these are the actions we would take immediately to start moving us towards real results. Unfortunately, we've seen greenhouse gases year after year go up under Mr. Trudeau, and that's just not getting it done. We want to see more habitat restoration, and we also want to see more jobs. And so the Conservatives in our Secure the Environment plan, we have that. I'd encourage people to go to conservative.ca/plan to see the Canada's Recovery Plan. And I just would like to say we want to work with everyone towards having an environment and to have a government where we can be proud of.
Ms. Michaud, how can you support the construction of new roads if you're serious about climate and reducing transportation emissions?
Merci pour la question, je l'attendais.
Thank you very much for the question. If we now look at Canada, there is a new project which is taking place in Quebec. Thanks for the opportunity that I have here to talk about it. We have to look at the big infrastructure project, which has to be as ecological as possible in our province. And I really think that it is more than just what the Liberal says. It tells the different provinces what to do or not to do. No, what we do, we have to look at the financing, for example, and we have to make sure that we have to look at what the taxpayers are doing. That's the federal party which has to say, they have to say whether yes or no, it's good for the environment. If it's good for the environment, we work together with them. And we have to look at this infrastructure project. We are going to get the help from the federal for all, and we're going to do that with all the projects that will be placed there. They will have zero
Thank you so much.
ecological
And
impact.
last,
negatively.
but certainly not least, Mr. Wilkinson.
And
you promised to plant 2 billion trees in 2019. We heard that the government has just started to plant 30 million. Your party committed to a just transition during the 2019 election, but only started a consultation process right before this election. How can voters trust that you will follow through on all the climate promises you make with ambition and urgency?
I think the proof is in the pudding. We have made enormous progress over the past few years. The tree program is underway, a whole range of other programs across every sector of the economy. I mean, look at any of the experts. People try to focus on Mark Jacquard, although I would say Mark Jacquard actually advises other governments, including the government of British Columbia, which is an NDP government. But look, atmospheric scientist Catherine Hayhoe, Stuart Elgie from the University of Ottawa, Generation Squeeze from UBC, climate scientist and former BC Green Party leader Andrew Weaver, all say the Liberal Party plan is best. We have been the best in terms of moving forward. In fact, the quote that Stuart Elgie said was the current Liberal government's done more to tackle climate change than the previous governments did in over 20 years, and almost more than any other government in the world at this time. So look at the record. I mean, the record is strong. We have developed a plan that will enable us to move forward and to ensure that we're fighting the climate crisis that we need to.
Merci tout le monde pour vos réponses.
Thank you very much for your answers. And we're now reaching the end of the panel. And if we look at this, we have seen that there's been a lot of questions that have been discussed. I also want to thank Fatima and also all the people who have been working with her, because we're really happy to have somebody of her caliber here. One of the big things which have been done, and actually one of the most important things, is actually to talk about it together in the community. That's exactly what I've been doing this evening. And even if we don't have the same opinions, well, we're thanking every single person, all the participants, because we have seen also lots of people have been there. Also would like to remind you that there is a survey, and we got the answers this morning. We can now place the links so that you can go and look at these questions. So again, big thank you, the big TH. And
I just want to thank the candidates again for your time this evening, as so close to election day, and for answering all our questions. I really do appreciate it. And thank you to all of you for listening in. If you have any questions or concerns, please do get in touch. We hope you learned something, and please go vote on Monday. Have a good evening.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Take care, everyone.
So much. Bye.